A lot of discussion about the so-called gender paradox. And that's a very interesting thing because it's really put their tails in a knot in Scandinavia. And that makes sense because the Scandinavians are going to have to deal with this first because they've gone the farthest down the road for like making their society gender equal. And what you find is there are systematic differences between men and women. And the biggest differences are that women experience more negative emotion and that they're more agreeable than men. And a lot of discussion about the so-called gender paradox. And that's a very interesting thing because it's really put their tails in a knot in Scandinavia. And that makes sense because the Scandinavians are going to have to deal with this first because they've gone the farthest down the road for like making their society gender equal.
But explain that to people
yeah,
if they don't might
I
not
will.
know
I will. Okay, so imagine first of all that there's two kinds of equality that you might pursue. One would be equality of opportunity, and so that would mean that there's wide range of talent across people regardless of their type, whatever that might be, sex, gender, race, ethnicity. There's talent distributed everywhere, and it's a kind of a truism, and I would say a truism of the West in the deepest sense, that each of the individuals within those groups should be put in a position where their talents they're encouraged to manifest those talents, partly because that would be good for them spiritually and psychologically, but also because that would be of obvious benefit to the community.
What you're saying here, although it's backed by the literature, it's obvious you have an expertise in this area. This is labeled as transphobic.
Yeah,
this is a transphobic
Well, it's even worse than that, because the data, and this was known, let's say 10 years ago before this all became an issue. Ken Zucker in Toronto, he was the world's leading authority on transgenderism. He divided it into two parts. There's the autogynephilic types. Those are the guys who get sexual kicks from dressing up in women's clothing and then go do drag queen story hour. Say, well, we're just, pristine and pure. It's like, no, you're not. You're getting a sexual kick from dressing up in women's clothing. And let's not bloody well forget it. And you can't even say that now, but every clinician worth his salt knew that for decades. And then there's another subpopulation, and those are usually gender non-conforming kids. And, like a conservative skeptic might say there's no such thing. It's like, no, there is. So your typical gender non-conforming kid would be the perfect target for this, would be a feminine boy or a masculine girl who's high in trait openness, so has kind of a mutable identity, who's also high in neuroticism.
There's good consensus on the 5. Okay, so now, as soon as you have the 5 basic traits, you can ask some questions like, well, do men and women differ? And so what you do is you just give the questionnaire. You can either fill it out yourself or have other people fill it out on your behalf. And it could be a teacher, it could be a parent, and that's all being done. And what you find is there are systematic differences between men and women. And the biggest differences are that women experience more negative emotion and that they're more agreeable than men. And that's borne out by the psychiatric evidence because higher levels of negative emotion are manifested in depression and anxiety, and women are diagnosed with higher levels of depression and anxiety all around the world. And with agreeableness, that's also borne out by the clinical literature in some sense, the medical literature, socio-medical literature, because disagreeable people are more likely to be incarcerated, because it's the best predictor of being incarcerated, even though it's not a very good predictor. And men are incarcerated at about a 10-to-1 rate compared to women and are more likely to be antisocial and conduct disordered. So the personality differences are mirrored in the socio-medical literature. Talent's rare, which people don't understand. There's lots of different kinds of talent, but in each domain it's rare. And so it's to everyone's benefit to exploit talented people to the maximal possible degree. So even if you're just selfish, you want to push for equality of opportunity because the more talented people there are out there, the more cool stuff you get to have, and hopefully the more diverse and interesting your life is. So you can pursue equality of opportunity policies, and the Scandinavians have done that, especially trying to knock down barriers for women in the workplace. And by all accounts, by all standard theories, the Scandinavian countries and places like the Netherlands, Canada too, to a slightly lesser degree, have gone farther than any other countries in pursuing those policies. Okay, and part of the consequence of that is that some of the differences between men and women have been minimized. So obviously there's far more women in the workplace than there were 40 years ago. And in many occupations, there's actually dominance by women. There's dominance in the universities, there's dominance in the healthcare fields. And so women have poured into the workplace. And hypothetically, there's problems with that because it's put a lot of stress on family structure. But hypothetically, that's for the best. And because it gives people a broader range of choices and it gives everyone access to more talent.
We could dwell on that for a minute too. One of the things we won't honestly discuss in our society, one of many, is the fundamental nature of female political psychopathology. You know, and there's male political psychopathology, obviously. That's what the feminists complain about all the time when they talk about the oppressive patriarchy, you know, toxic masculinity. There's no shortage of toxic masculinity. So is there any toxic femininity? Well, not if the feminine is just the, you know, oppressed virgin goddess whose nature, but how about we don't live in that fantasy world? And we know, yeah, there's female political pathology, the tendency to infantilize everyone, and the tendency to assume that everyone who doesn't go along with the infantilization is properly characterized as a predator. And so, you know, you wonder, why are the universities turning into extended daycares? Well, a lot of the reason for that is that women who don't have anything better to do are turning the university students into the infants they never had. So, yeah,
Jesus.
I don't know when we'll be able to be mature enough to have that conversation.
And also, if you look around the world, you see that one of the best predictors of the probability of economic development in developing countries is the attitude in those countries towards equal rights for women. And it looks causal. The more positively the country is predisposed to female rights, the more likely they are to develop economically. And maybe that's because that indicates that they're open to new ideas or something like that, or open to transformation. So, okay, so that's one kind of equality. Open up the playing field so that everybody has a chance to compete and cooperate and land where they will. But then the other kind of equality is equality of outcome. So, and that's often described as equity in today's language. And so the ultimate equity utopia would be take every job, every conceivable kind of job, and then stratify that by every conceivable level of authority within every job. And then ensure that every single category of person is represented in precise proportion to their prevalence in the population. So every job should be 50% women and 50% men, and say 13% non-Western ethnic minority, and whatever that happens to be, and then you could break that down. And otherwise there's evidence of systemic prejudice.